My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. I'm writing this because I've spent the last 3 years sitting with what happened, and I think I'm finally ready to say it out loud, even if it's just to strangers on the internet. This story starts with a dinner party that I wasn't supposed to remember the way I do. I was 28, freshly promoted to senior brand strategist at the marketing firm where I'd been grinding for 6 years. I'd just landed the Meridian account, a massive pharmaceutical client that everyone in the office had been chasing. My boss pulled me aside after the pitch and said, "That was incredible. You just made the biggest sale this company's seen in a decade." I remember standing in the hallway, shaking, trying not to cry because I was so proud of myself. That weekend, my parents hosted dinner at their house. They'd invited their friends, people they'd known for years, people they showed off around. My mom had made her usual spread, the same dishes she'd made for 20 years, and my dad had opened a good bottle of wine. Everything was the way it always was. Halfway through the meal, Dad raised his glass. "I wanted to toast my daughter," he said, looking at me with this smile that I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to something performative. "She just closed a major deal at work, multi-million-dollar contract. It's something the entire family should be proud of." I felt my shoulders soften. For a second I thought, okay, maybe he's actually proud. Maybe he's actually going to acknowledge what I did. "The thing is," he continued, and I heard my mom laugh beside him, "Sarah's never had the best head for business. She's always been the artistic one, the dreamer. So I've been coaching her for years on how to think strategically, how to negotiate. I basically sat down with her before this pitch and told her exactly what to do, walked her through the whole thing." My fork was halfway to my plate. "If it wasn't for me," he said, still smiling, still holding his wine glass like this was a beautiful moment, "I honestly don't think she would have landed it, but I'm glad she's finally listening to her old man." Everyone laughed, his friends nodded. My mom reached over and patted my arm like I was a child who'd just done their first painting, and I sat there, my chest tight, my face burning, unable to say a single thing. He had not coached me. He had not sat down with me before the pitch. He had never in 6 years shown any interest in what I actually did for work beyond asking if my job was still going okay at Thanksgiving. I had built that pitch from the ground up. I had stayed up until 2 a.m. 3 nights in a row, rewriting the strategy document. I had presented it to my team, listened to their feedback, revised it again. I had walked into that conference room and sold a multi-million-dollar contract on the back of work that was entirely, completely mine. And in front of a dinner table of people, my father had erased that. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and stood there for 5 minutes, staring at myself in the mirror, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. I remember thinking that I needed to understand what had just happened, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe he was just being a typical dad, exaggerating his role in something. But even then, I knew the difference between exaggeration and fiction. He had invented an entire narrative where I was incompetent, and he was my savior. When I came back out, dinner was continuing as normal. My mom was telling a story about someone's grandchild. My dad was laughing with one of his friends. No one was looking at me. I sat down and moved food around my plate for the rest of the evening. The thing is, I probably should have seen this coming. My parents have always been people who needed to look good. Not just aesthetically, though my mom definitely cared about that, the right clothes, the right furniture, the right wine to serve guests. But more than that, they needed to be seen as good, successful, wise. My dad especially had this thing where he was always the smartest person in the room. He knew everyone's business. He had opinions on everything. He was the one who made things happen. Growing up, I had 2 brothers. My oldest brother, Michael, became a lawyer. My middle brother, David, became an engineer. Both of them were successful, both of them had good lives, but the success felt different for them. I remember my dad actually talking about the pride he felt when Michael won a case or when David was promoted. He'd tell those stories with genuine warmth, but there was something else under it, a sense of ownership, like their accomplishments somehow reflected directly on him. For me, it was always slightly off. I'd done well in school. I was good at my classes, especially anything involving creativity or communication, but I remember my parents talking about my grades to people in this strange way, like they were surprised that I was smart. "We didn't realize she had it in her," I heard my mom say once to a neighbor. I was standing right there, still in my school uniform. That phrase stuck with me. I was in my own house, and my mother was talking about me like I wasn't there. like my intelligence was a surprising development rather than something that had always been part of me. In college, I started to understand what I wanted to do. I was good with people. I understood how to communicate, how to frame things, how to get people excited about ideas. I started thinking about marketing, about brand strategy. My dad, when I told him, had this look on his face, like I'd said I wanted to be an artist or a musician, something impractical. Marketing, he said, okay, sure, but I hope you understand how competitive it is. You're going to need a really strong mentor, someone who knows the industry, otherwise you're going to be lost. He didn't offer to be that mentor, he just planted the seed that I was going to fail without one. I got my degree, I applied to firms, I interviewed. I was good at interviewing because I was good at reading people and understanding what they wanted to hear. I got an offer. I was excited. I told my parents, and my dad spent the whole conversation telling me about someone he knew at a big agency, someone he'd gone to school with, and how he was going to call them up and put in a good word for me. He never did. I asked him about it a few weeks later, and he said he'd been too busy, but he'd get around to it. I didn't need his call. I got the job on my own merit. I worked hard at that firm, learned constantly, built relationships, made myself valuable. By year 3, I was doing the work of a senior strategist for a mid-level strategist's salary. By year 5, I'd finally gotten the title to match. By year 6, I was the person they called when it mattered. But somewhere in there, I'd internalized his voice. Even after I was promoted, even after I was good at my job, I felt like a fraud sometimes. I'd close a successful campaign and I'd think, is this actually good, or does it just seem good because everyone's being nice to me? When I was praised, there was this small voice saying, yes, but did you really deserve that? If I'd been doing it differently, if you weren't so naturally charming, would anyone actually think your work was good? This voice sounded like my father. After the dinner party, things shifted, or maybe I just started paying attention. About a week later, my mom called. She had the tone she used when she was about to ask me for something while pretending it wasn't a big deal. Your father was wondering if you could talk to him about some business strategy stuff, she said. He's thinking about making some changes at work, and he thought it might be good to get your input. My dad had been an accountant for 35 years. He'd never asked me for input on anything before. I said yes, even though I didn't want to. When we had coffee, he spent 40 minutes telling me about his firm's problems. Clients weren't as loyal, younger employees were leaving, things weren't as profitable as they used to be. Then he asked me what I thought. I told him the truth. The business was structured like it was 1995. His firm didn't have a social media presence. They weren't connecting with younger clients. They were charging outdated rates. They needed to modernize, or they needed to accept that they weren't going to stay competitive. He listened, nodded, and I thought maybe this would be one of those moments where he actually heard me. 2 weeks later, my mom mentioned that he was implementing some of Sarah's ideas at the firm. He was being quoted in a business email to his partners about updated strategies for client retention. When I asked my mom if he'd mentioned anything to me, she said, I think he's still workshopping it. He never told me he'd shared my advice with his firm. He just took what I'd said and presented it as his own thinking. I started noticing other things after that, small things. I'd mentioned something I was working on at dinner, a project, a challenge I was trying to solve. A week later, my dad would bring it up with his friends, but the way he told it made it sound like he was the one helping me figure it out. Sarah wasn't sure how to approach this client situation, so I told her. No, I hadn't asked him. I'd mentioned it offhandedly while he asked how my day was. I'd get promoted and my parents would throw a small dinner. My dad would give a speech about how proud he was, but there would always be this underlying message. She's doing well, but it's because of the values we instilled in her, or because we made sure she had the right opportunities, or because of his guidance. Never because I was simply competent. My therapist, when I finally started seeing one, said something that landed hard. You keep seeking validation from people who seem structurally incapable of giving it to you, not because of you, because they need your achievements to be partly theirs. I think I'd known that on some level, but hearing it out loud made something in me feel very still. The breaking point came during the worst year of my career. I'd been at my firm for 8 years, I was a senior strategist, I was good at my job, and then the pandemic happened and our biggest client, a luxury hospitality brand, had everything collapse. They went under. It was sudden. 1 month they were fine, the next month they were closing locations and laying off staff. Our contract with them was terminated. We lost most of the revenue that account had been bringing in. At work it wasn't my fault, the economy imploded, everyone understood that. But I was still the lead strategist on that account, I still felt responsible. I went into a kind of emotional tailspin. I wasn't sleeping, I was drinking too much. I'd go to the office and sit at my desk and feel like I was failing. During this time I think I was reaching out in small ways. I mentioned to my parents that work was rough, that I was struggling. I thought maybe, for once, they could just tell me it wasn't my fault, that they were proud of me anyway, that they cared about me as a person and not as an extension of their own success. What happened instead was my mom called and told me that my dad was at a golf event, and he'd mentioned to a colleague that I was going through a rough patch at work, probably because I'd gotten in over my head. She said it in that way she had, like she was delivering information, not judgment, but the judgment was so clearly there. I remember saying, "Mom, I didn't say I was in over my head. I said work was difficult because we lost a client in a difficult year. That's not the same thing." "Well," she said, "he's just trying to be supportive. If things are hard, maybe it's a good opportunity to reassess whether you're in the right position." I'm not even sure she realized what she was doing. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was just parroting my father's interpretation of my life back to me, and in doing so, she was stripping away any context or nuance or my own understanding of my experience. That night, I cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not like sobbing, but like something in my chest was breaking into pieces. I sat on my apartment floor at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I thought about my entire life, about every moment where my parents had looked at my accomplishments and found a way to diminish them, and I realized that I had internalized their voice so completely that I was doing it to myself even when they weren't in the room. I didn't call them, I didn't confront them, I just stopped. I stopped mentioning things about my work. I stopped sharing parts of my life. When they called, I was pleasant but distant. When they asked how things were going, I said fine, everything's fine, and I steered the conversation to them. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone quiet and guarded and small. For about 3 months I existed in a kind of grey zone. I went to work, I did my job. I did it well enough but without the investment, without the passion I'd once had. My boss asked if everything was okay. I said yes, I wasn't okay, but I didn't know how to explain why. Then something happened that shifted everything. A new client came to the firm, another luxury brand but tech-focused, cutting edge. They were young, ambitious, and they wanted someone with fresh ideas to lead their strategy. My boss called me into his office. "I know you've been going through it," he said, "but I think this is the right project for you. I think you need something to sink your teeth into. No pressure if you don't feel up to it, but I'm going to be honest, you're the only one I want on this account." I should have said no, part of me wanted to, but there was something in his confidence that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in months. I took the project, and I threw myself into it in a way that surprised even me. I researched the brand's competitors. I understood their target market. I went back to first principles of what made a campaign resonant and authentic. I built something from the ground up that I was genuinely proud of. It wasn't just good work. It was work that felt like me. When I presented it to the client, they loved it. They signed a contract that was bigger than the last one. My boss actually pulled me aside afterward and said, "Whatever was going on with you, I'm glad you're back." I was back, but I was back different. For the first time, my success didn't feel like something I needed to apologize for or diminish or share credit for. It was mine, and I realized something sitting in that feeling. If I let my parents have parts of it, if I let them rewrite my narrative the way they always had, I was essentially agreeing with them about who I was. I was agreeing that I couldn't own my own life. I made a decision that day that was quiet and sharp and final. I was going to gather proof. I was going to document everything, all the projects I'd led, all the campaigns I'd created, all the pitches I'd given, all the clients I'd brought in. And I was going to do it not in some dramatic, confrontational way, but because I wanted to know the truth about myself, even if no one else ever saw it. I started a document on my personal computer. I compiled portfolios of my work. I asked my boss if he could write a letter of reference detailing my specific accomplishments and the aspects of my role that were entirely my responsibility. He said yes without questioning why. I reached out to colleagues and former mentors and asked them to give me honest feedback about my work. I did this over the course of 6 months, and what emerged was this clear, undeniable picture of someone who was genuinely talented and capable, and had built a real career through her own effort and intelligence. It sounds simple when I write it like that, but it wasn't. Every time I looked at those files, every time I read what people had written about my work, I had to sit with the voice in my head that said, "But are you really, though?" And I had to learn to answer that voice with evidence, with proof, with the testimony of people who had no reason to lie about what I'd accomplished. It took me a year before I felt ready, and then my parents asked me to come home for Thanksgiving. I almost didn't go, but I realized that if I didn't go, if I just retreated, then nothing changed. They would still believe their version of my life, and I needed them to know, finally, that I had always known the truth. My parents live in the suburbs about 2 hours away. My brothers were both coming home too. My mom had been planning the meal for weeks. She called me the night before asking if I had any dietary preferences, as if I hadn't grown up eating the same meal every year. When I got there, it was the same as it had always been. My mom had prepared everything. My dad had somehow already positioned himself as the patriarch of the dining room, directing people to their seats. My brothers were there with their partners. It was the Thanksgiving that happened every year. For most of the meal, I was quiet. I ate my turkey and my stuffing. I listened to my dad talk about a case he was working on, something one of his friends had told him, a political opinion he'd read somewhere. He was the center of every conversation, even the ones that didn't involve him. Then near the end, my oldest brother Michael said, "Sarah, I heard about the tech client. That's impressive." "Yeah," I said, "it was a big project." "What was your role on that?" my dad asked, in a way that made it seem like he was just asking for clarity, but we both knew what he was really asking. "I led the full strategy," I said. "I conceptualized the campaign, did the research, created the framework, did the pitch." "Must have been a big team," my dad said. "It was just me," I said, "supported by my boss, but the strategy and execution were mine." There was a moment of quiet. My mom was looking at her plate. My dad was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's great," he said, in a tone that made it clear he thought the conversation was finished. I put my fork down. "I want to say something," I said. My voice was very steady, even though my heart was racing. "I've spent a long time thinking about the way this family talks about my career, and I think it's important that everyone in this room understands something. Every achievement I've had because I worked for it, not because anyone guided me, not because anyone taught me, because I showed up and did the work." My dad was already shaking his head. "Sarah, no one's saying." "You actually have," I said, repeatedly, and I've let it happen for so long that I started to believe it myself. I started to believe that maybe I hadn't earned the things I'd earned, that maybe I was just lucky or charming, or that I was succeeding because of some external factor instead of my own competence, and I'm not going to do that anymore. My mom reached over and tried to touch my arm. I moved it away. "I don't need you to be proud of me anymore," I said, and I could feel my voice getting thinner, more fragile, but I kept going. "I needed that when I was 7, I needed that when I was 17, but I'm 31 years old and I'm asking you now to just acknowledge the truth, which is that I have built a career. I've built it myself, and I'm good at what I do, not because of you, because of me." My dad stood up. "This is not appropriate," he said. "Not here, not in front of everyone." "This is exactly where this needs to happen," I said, "because you do this in front of people. You rewrite my story in front of people. You make it sound like everything I've accomplished is because of you, and then you go home and you believe it. And I can't stop you from telling that story, but I can stop believing it." My brothers were silent. My brother David was looking at me with this expression of understanding, like maybe he'd been thinking about versions of this his whole life too. My dad said something about how I was being dramatic and that this wasn't how we solved problems in this family, and honestly I stopped listening. Because that sentence, "not how we solve problems," is exactly right. We don't solve problems in this family. We ignore them, we talk around them. We rewrite them so that the person with the most fragile ego comes out looking good. I didn't blow up, I didn't yell. I didn't bring out the portfolio I'd compiled, the evidence I'd gathered. I think part of me thought I would, but that wasn't what this was about. This wasn't about convincing him. He didn't get to decide if I was good at my job. I already knew I was. What I needed was to say it out loud, in front of people, and not take it back. After dinner I left. I said goodbye to my brothers, I thanked my mom for the meal, and I meant it sincerely because she had made the meal, and I drove back to the city. I didn't cry on the drive. I felt very clear and very separate from everything. For about 2 weeks after that, my parents didn't contact me. I think they were waiting for me to apologize or come back to them with my tail between my legs and admit that I'd been out of line. My mom finally called on a Sunday. "Your father is very hurt," she said, which was such a classic opening that I almost laughed. "I'm sure he is," I said. "You embarrassed him in front of your family." "No," I said. "I told the truth in front of my family, that's different." She wanted me to explain myself further, to soften my position, to frame what I'd said as a misunderstanding. I didn't. I was polite, but I didn't capitulate. Here's the part that I didn't expect, the part that recontextualizes things. 2 weeks after that phone call, I got a call from my brother Michael. He wanted to get coffee, just the two of us. I met him at a cafe near my apartment, and he looked uncomfortable in that way he got when he had something difficult to say. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I should have told you a long time ago." He proceeded to tell me that Dad had called him after Thanksgiving in a state. Not angry, but kind of falling apart. Apparently my words had done something to him. Michael said that Dad had admitted to him that he'd been jealous of my career, that I'd accomplished things he never had, and that he'd responded by trying to diminish them. He didn't frame it as an apology. He framed it as confusion. He couldn't understand why he'd felt the need to do that, why he'd been unable to just be proud. He said, Michael told me carefully, that what you said about how you stopped believing in yourself really got to him. He said he realized that he'd done the same thing to himself when he was your age, and his parents had done it to him. He said he doesn't know how to stop. I don't know what I was expecting to feel when I heard this. Relief, maybe, vindication, but what I actually felt was very, very sad. Because the truth is that my father genuinely didn't mean to hurt me the way he did. He was operating from his own wounds, his own insecurities, his own learned patterns about how to be a man or a parent or a person who matters. That doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't erase the years I spent doubting myself because of him, but it does mean that he wasn't actually my enemy. He was just broken and didn't know how to fix it. Michael asked if I wanted to talk to Dad about what he'd said. I didn't. Not then anyway. I said I would think about it. I've been thinking about it for 3 years. We've had a relationship since Thanksgiving, but it's not the same. I call my parents once a week. We have dinner maybe twice a year. My dad doesn't talk about my career the way he used to. When I mention something I've done, he listens and says, "That sounds great, I'm glad that worked out." It's not warm, it's not quite what I would want, but it's honest and it doesn't require me to diminish myself. I think about that dinner at Thanksgiving sometimes, and I realize that what I did wasn't actually revenge. It wasn't about making him look foolish. It was about refusing to be invisible anymore. It was about saying, I exist and my work exists and my life exists, and I don't need your permission or your validation or your rewritten version of my story. What happened after that was just consequences. His own shame, his own recognition of patterns he hadn't wanted to see, that part was on him. I still have the portfolio I compiled. I look at it sometimes, and I remember the person I became while I was creating it. Someone who didn't need anyone else's approval. Someone who knew her own value because she'd proven it to herself. That's the thing no one tells you about standing up for yourself. It doesn't fix the other person. It doesn't create the relationship you wanted. It doesn't undo the damage or answer all the questions. What it does is give you permission to move forward without needing them to understand. And sometimes that's more valuable than any apology could ever be.